Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So welcome to our tutorial. Okay, so today's tutorial is going to be a bit longer because we have 3 studios worth of materials to cover. All right. So let me get started. Okay, about 31 of you already here. Okay, so we can get started now. Okay, so these slides and the answers all will be uploaded after the tutorial. And as usual, I'll also send you all the link for the recording so you can view for your revision. Okay, for the midterm assessment, we will be releasing some the past year questions as well as some practice questions for you all to have a look. And have a feel of the type of questions that we have been asking. Okay, so you know how to prepare. All right, so I think that one most likely next week or so we should be releasing. Okay, so next week, as I mentioned, it's only Studio 1. Okay, there's no Studio 2 and there's no tutorial as well. Okay, because of our Chinese New Year break. Okay. Okay, so let's start off with our first part for this today's tutorial, which is on GPIO. Okay. So in this first question here, we are basically looking at the ports, and how we can make use of the ports. Okay, in the studio, you have already experienced how to configure the register and how to either write or read to a port pin. Okay, and now we're going to look into some other aspects of using the GPIO port that you need to take into consideration. Okay, so in the ATmega, in the Arduino Uno development board that you have, okay, that board is already mapped in a certain way. Okay, some of the pins. All right. So if you look at your port layout here, okay, so maybe I can zoom into our schematic here. Okay, so if you look at your schematic, you will see that port B, okay, I only have 0 to 5. That means I only have 6 pins available. I don't have pin 6 and pin 7. All right, so where did pin 6 and pin 7 go? Okay, that means they were already mapped, okay, to or used for some other reason. All right, so what did we use those pins for? Okay, so in order for us to understand that, we need to look back at our data sheet. Okay, so this data sheet I actually uploaded for last the first studio, the week 3 studio 2 on GPIO. All right, so you should always keep this with you, all right, to reference. I mean, not only for this module, any time you're dealing with any embedded board or any microcontroller, you should always have that data sheet at hand, so that anytime you want to reference anything and you want to find out something, the information should be inside there. Okay, so if you look at the section 5 here on the pin configurations, I mean, this is something you also have in notes. You will see all the pins, all right, and you can see that port B pin 6 and port B pin 7 here. Okay, they are both there, but currently they are also mapped to crystal 1 and crystal 2 pins. Okay, crystal 1 and crystal 2 pins. Okay, and you remember I asked you during the studio what frequency or what clock we are running on. Okay, and it was a small silver color sort of component on the board. All right, so that is actually the crystal, and that is tied to your crystal 1 and crystal 2 pins. Okay, the 16 megahertz clock. Okay, so because it is already used for this external clock, we are not able to use port 6, port B, pin 6 and pin 7 in the actual Arduino Uno board. All right, so these are some of the important considerations that you must take into account when you're building your own, when you're using any readily available board. Okay, you will always have some restrictions and some limitations depending on what you are or on what is available for you to use. Okay, so in this question, we've asked you, you have decided, okay, to create your own board. Okay, so how do you create your own board? Okay, so let's say you are, with all the ideas you get from EPP1, EPP2, you have something fantastic. You want to create a startup company, and start working on it immediately, and you want to use the Arduino, correct? Of course, when you're prototyping it, you may use the development board, okay? But when it reaches a stage where you want to customize and make your own board so that you can mass produce, you do not want to ship with the Arduino Uno, correct? It will be a waste of money. Okay, you just want to strip it down to the bare minimum. Okay, so what is the bare minimum? The bare minimum, okay, is basically just the controller chip, your power, and your clock. Okay, your crystal. So this is basically the bare minimum you need, okay, in order to actually have a microcontroller running. Because a microcontroller is already a single chip solution. Okay, so even if you look back at your schematic, okay, your schematic is actually very complicated, correct? Let me go back there. The schematic is of course very complicated with a lot of things. Okay, so a lot of this additional stuff is there because you are still in the debugging phase. So you have all this. So this chip here, the Atmega 16 and so on, that is for you to help you perform the serial transfer of data, okay, and reflash your code uh, into the Atmega. Okay, so that is where this device comes in. All right, but once you are going to mass produce, you don't need all this other stuff. You just need the Atmega 328 plus your power and your clock. Okay, and your code will just boot up and it will just run by itself. Okay, once it's ready, flashed in. Okay, so definitely it is possible. Okay, so your own board. All right, uh, and you want to, let's say, mass produce or whatever. Is it possible for me to make use of all the 8 bits of the port B? Okay, because we just saw that port B, pin 7 and pin 6 is for the crystal, correct? And I just also mentioned that you need to have a clock for your system to run. Okay, so is it still possible that I use uh, or I'm able to use port 6 and port 7, pin 6 and pin 7 from port B if I'm doing my design? So the answer is, again, in most cases, the answer is always inside the datasheet. So you need to look inside and find that information. So if you look in your datasheet, okay, in table 13.1, okay, you can see that there are actually different clocking options within the Atmega device. Okay, this is something quite common across all microcontrollers. Okay, when you look at any microcontroller, it will have a variety of clocking options. Okay, and in most cases, you will also have some internal clocking option. So when you say internal, it means that I don't actually need to connect an external chip, an external crystal to my controller. I can use the internal clock to actually clock my controller. All right, so inside your device, your Atmega, you can actually use the internal clock, and that can help you to free up port B, pin 7, and pin 6. Okay, so you can also look at this from the data sheet itself. Okay, so I always like to reference back to the data sheet, okay, because I want you all to make it a habit to be able to find the necessary information there. So if you look at section 4 block diagram, this is a very nice overview that gives you all the peripherals and subsystems that we have. And if you zoom in here, the clock generation, you can see that, okay, we have crystal, external crystal capability, and you also have the other options here. Okay, so all these are available options depending on what kind of a design you are looking for. All right. Now, of course, every decision that we make will have some trade-offs. All right. So when we decide to use internal clock, for example, then what is the trade-off? Okay. So the internal factor, I mean, internal clock usage is definitely easy option. All right. But when we choose internally, you only have 2 possible clock frequencies available, correct? Because it's already hardwired inside the system. Okay, if you are going to use external clock, then no problem. Okay, I can use 16 megahertz, 12 megahertz, 14 megahertz, 18 megahertz, up to me. Correct, as long as I stay within the limits of what is specified by the manufacturer, all right, it will still be fine. Okay. Another interesting thing that you might try sometime in the future is you will observe that in many cases sometimes you will be able to exceed manufacturer specs and still have the device working fine. Okay, so for example, if the microcontroller says that, or the manufacturer says that the maximum frequency is, let's say, 20 megahertz. Okay, if you clock it at 25, okay, or sometimes even 30, you might see that it is still working fine. Okay, it's still working fine. All right, do not assume this to be the norm or to be fine. All right, it could be just a one-off thing. All right, because uh, the manufacturer guarantees reliability up to only a particular range of operation. All right, so you should always stick with that. All right, when you are using the system, if you really need to clock it at a much higher rate, then you should already choose a device that is able to go at that required frequency. Okay, don't overclock it and push it too much. Okay, it might work and some things might fail. Okay, so it's better not to do that. Okay, so what are the other important points that we need to be aware of? Okay, so when you're choosing the frequency, what are the factors you need to consider? Firstly, of course, you want to meet timing constraint. Okay, in most cases, from the work that you're doing, we don't specifically put in any timing constraints yet. Okay, when we say we press the push button, the LED light up, we say it's fine. All right, we haven't really put in a requirement to say that when I press the push button, it must light up within uh, maybe 2 microseconds. Okay, let's say I give you this kind of timing constraints. Then you need to factor in the complexity of the system, the code, and whether your clock frequency also can be adjusted to meet this requirement. Okay, so that is one thing. The other is, of course, power consumption. The higher the clock frequency, generally you will have higher power consumption. So you also need to think of that as an important consideration. And like what I mentioned, the stability. You always want to stay within the manufacturer's limit. Okay, not push it beyond that. Okay, so the implications to the code whenever you change the frequency are all the timing related features. Okay, like what we did yesterday for the PWM. All right, when we are calculating the duty cycle values and so on. All right, or the pre-scaler when we're setting it, all of it is based on what is the current frequency that the system is clocking on. And then if you change the clock or the frequency of operation, then some of those parameters will change. All right, then you need to recalculate. All right, so these are the implications to the code if let's say you change your clock frequency later on. Okay, so that is a discussion on to give you the idea of uh, factors that you need to consider when you are putting a system together. When you are using the board, that is one aspect, but when you're building it separately on your own, then you can have a lot more flexibility and freedom to decide how you want to configure it. Okay, in question 2, we are going to look at the active logic, okay, of a particular peripheral. Okay, so this applies to switches, LEDs, and so on. What is active logic? Active logic basically means that in the case of input, okay, what is the logic I will read when that input is activated? Okay, if in the case of output, what is the logic that I need to provide in order to sort of activate that particular output device? Okay, in our studio, we were performing or we were building a circuit in active high configuration. So in terms of the microcontroller, and this is my port pin, okay, I connected it this way. All right, so the logic 1, okay, which will translate to 5 volts, would drive the LED. Okay, so our logic 1 turns on the LED. Here we are asking you to draw a circuit connection to connect the LED in the reverse manner, that means active low. Okay, so in this case, you need to apply a logic 0 to turn it on and logic 1 to turn it off. Okay, so the way to do it is you connect the anode of the LED to plus VCC, all right, and then the cathode is through the resistor and to port B pin 1 in this case. Okay, so again, when we say active high, active low, the way in which you think is what is the logic level I apply to the pin in order to activate that particular peripheral device. Okay. Okay, so in this case, in this question, you asked to write the code to set the DDRB register value according to this design. So this is the design. So the DDRB is basically setting input and output, correct? So for this question, we need to set it to output by doing an OR with a 1. Okay, so some of you might think that the current is flowing in, all right, so should it be considered input? No, all right. The way you configure is based on whether I'm writing to the pin or reading from the pin. So as far as you are concerned, this is connected to an output device, which is LED. So I'm writing to port B pin 1. Okay, I'm writing to port B pin 1, so it is still considered to be an output pin. So I set that particular bit to a 1. All right, and you must, if you're still not familiar or not sure about this AND and OR and those masking operations, please look back at our studio and get familiarized with it. All right, because you need to be aware of how to set certain bits, okay, without affecting other bits that may have already been configured. All right, so that is why we always emphasize the need to do correct masking operation, either or and then you mask out certain bits and so on. Okay, so in this case, what we say is the microcontroller is sinking current. Okay, in the other way, okay, in the other active high configuration, we say it is sourcing current. That means current is flowing out. Okay, current is flowing out into the LED. In our design just now, okay, the current is flowing in to the LED. Okay, so current is flowing into the LED. So we say it's sinking current. Okay, so when it's sinking current, okay, we need to be careful because every microcontroller pin has some operating limits, okay, on how much current it can actually sink in. If you try to put in or pump in too much of current, okay, while it is sinking, it can potentially damage the pin. All right, so we need to refer back to the data sheet. Okay, so let me just show you from the data sheet over here. So table 32.2. Okay, so let me switch over to the data sheet. Okay, so this chapter 32 is on electrical characteristics. So this is the chapter, okay, that is usually towards the end of any microcontroller data sheet that will tell you all these DC characteristics, clocking, the maximum ratings, the timing parameters, and so on. Okay, so if you look at this common DC characteristics, okay, the input when you have an output low voltage, the input current, that means the amount of current that you can sink in, is 20 milliampere. Okay, it's 20 milliampere. All right, so that is the information that we've extracted and put over here. Okay, so there's also a small note here. Okay, the number 4 there. So what does that mean? Okay, so that is also important to look at. Okay, just to make sure that we do not make any other assumptions. So if you look at the note 4 from the data sheet, it will tell you that even though I say each pin is 20 milliampere that I can sink, there is still a limit, okay, between a group of pins. Okay, between a group of pins. That means the sum of C0 to C5 plus ADC 7 and 6, okay, should not exceed 100 milliampere. Okay, should not exceed 100 milliampere. Okay, give me a minute. Okay, so the sum of currents, okay, for these pins okay, should not exceed 100 milliampere. That means, for example, if I just take C0 to C5 over here, okay, if I just take C0 to C5, that is already 6 pins, all right, 6 pins. And if all these 6 pins are seeking current at 20 milliampere each, that already blows this limit. Okay, so you have to be mindful. Okay, so you cannot when you're designing your circuit, all right, so these are some of the things that you need to factor in, all right, to make sure you do not exceed, all right. Generally I would say that the limits given by the manufacturer are always very safe limits, all right. That means they do factor in some buffer, but you should not think in terms of, okay, there is some buffer so I can push it a bit and so on. All right, try to stick within what are the limits given by the manufacturer. Okay, the last one is just a quick recap of your circuit principles. The voltage drop across the LED is 0.7 volts. All right, so it is nothing more than a simple circuit analysis. All right, you have a LED and a resistor, and you have maximum current of 20 milliampere. All right, and this voltage drop is 0.7 volts, and this is 5 volts, so you can find the resistance using Ohm's law. Okay, so the minimum value of R is 215 ohms. Okay, so that's the minimum value. Anything higher is fine. All right, but you should not get anything lower, because then you have more than 20 milliampere going into the pin. All right, so that is question 2. Okay, so some further discussion on GPIO concepts. So what is the source current? So just now we looked at the sinking current. So what is the source current? That means in our studio when we were driving the LEDs and so on, what was the amount of current that was actually coming out? All right, so 20 milliampere, again, absolute maximum is 40 milliampere. So you can push up to 40 milliampere, all right, depending on uh, certain configurations. Okay, so in this case, they have put as a negative sign to say that the current is coming out, okay, of the device. So is this enough? Okay, is this enough? It all depends on what you are trying to do. Okay, what you're trying to do. Okay, if you are driving an LED, then definitely not an issue. But if you're trying to drive a motor, then it may not be enough. Okay, a small those hobby car kind of a very small DC motor, that is still fine. You will still be able to spin and so on. But in our project and like what we are doing, you need to the motor itself has higher power requirements, and you're driving a heavy load. All right, so that kind of a voltage and requirement is not enough. So that is where the driver chip comes in. Okay, so we will look at that later part. Okay, and question 3 is on power consumption. We will go a lot more deeper into power consumption towards the end, last few studios. All right, and we will revisit some of these topics. So power consumption is definitely a very important part, because most microcontrollers are used in embedded handheld devices. So you want to be able to put that device into a standby mode or low power mode, okay, whenever it is not doing anything useful. Okay, so most microcontrollers have some capabilities of doing some power management. Okay, the Arduino, I mean the Atmega 328 that we have, has some very basic stuff which can help us cut down the power that the device is actually going to consume. So that is actually achieved through this register called the sleep mode control register, and it allows us to put the device into one of these different modes. Okay, so we will not go into the details of this mode, all right, but we can see that it is able to put my device into specific modes of operation, okay, to allow me to save power. So if I want to, for example, put it into a standby mode, then I need to write a value of 110 into this register here. Okay, so when you put into a standby mode, all right, that means it's a low power mode. That means many of the IOs or ports may be in this sort of sleep mode. So when it's in a sleep mode, how do I wake up the device, all right, and start to work? It's just like when your handphone goes to sleep when you never use it for a while. What kind of event can wake up your handphone. All right, you can press a button, or there can be an incoming call or incoming message. Correct. So some events can wake up the device. All right, and put it into a more higher power state. So similarly, in the microcontroller, you also have these kind of events that can trigger and wake up the microcontroller. So you can press the reset or power button. Okay, you can have interrupts as well, like what you saw. So an interrupt is also a mechanism that can be used to uh, wake up a device, okay, from its sleep mode. Okay, how many clock cycle does it take to come out of standby mode to full operation? Okay, so it takes 6 clock cycles. Okay, so this one, no need to worry. We're not going to go into the details of this. But why are we discussing this? Because you must understand that it takes some time. All right, so it is not immediate that when interrupt triggers, it just wakes up and it can immediately do. All right, so it takes some time for the device to sort of wake up and come to a state where it is able to process and execute instructions. Then it can start doing the required activities. Okay, so it can come out of standby mode and go to full operation within 6 clock cycles. Okay, uh, so in this question, we are saying that you do not need to use the ADC module for this project. Okay, so let's take it as that first. And you do not want to, since you're not going to use it, you want to disable it. All right, so that you don't consume any additional power. All right. So most peripheral blocks in the microcontroller can be switched on or switched off depending on whether you want to use it or not going to use it. So this register here called the power reduction register, okay, PRR, is able to do that for us. Okay, and it has individual bits to control the power to different subsystems. Okay, so for example, your timer 0 that we have seen, okay, and then we're going to be looking at UART, ADC, and so on. So if I'm not interested or I'm not going to use the ADC module, then I can write a one to it to clear, or what I want to it to make sure that it is powered down. Okay, and that will uh, help me reduce the power consumption. Okay, you will also be covering more on power consumption for the RPI module as well. Okay, so for the Arduino itself, there are some modules that you need not use and you can power them down. And at the RPI side, also there are a lot of modules that you do not need to use. Okay, because once your RPI module is mounted on your robot, okay, and you're actually doing the actual run, you don't need the HDMI port, you don't need the some other peripheral ports, okay, that you use while you are still writing your code and debugging. Correct. So all those subsystems can actually be powered down, all right, to help you save power, reduce your power consumption as well. Okay, so in terms of some other discussion, all right, one of the things that you need to be aware of is certification. Okay, if you look at most electrical appliances, say look at a fridge or aircon or something like that, or a TV. Nowadays, everywhere you go at the corner of the fridge or what, they'll put a sticker there, okay, with ticks that tell you how the power consumption is for this device. Okay, and that is important, correct? Because now people start to look at it. All right, start to look at it to buy. All right, for a handheld device, we are more interested in knowing whether it can at least last for one full day, correct? Before I need to plug in my power again. But for devices at home which you use regularly, your TV, your fridge, your aircon, and so on, you will want to look at how energy efficient it is, so that your monthly bills and electricity bill is not too much. Okay, so it is important, all right, to meet energy standards, all right, and in some countries they are also very strict about it. If you do not meet certain energy requirements, you may not be allowed to sell your product there. Okay, so these are important things you need to be aware of to make sure your product does meet these requirements. All right, and energy consumption, okay, is basically a system level thought process. Okay, so it's not just a microcontroller. Okay, it is everything integrated together. All right, so you need to look at every aspect of the design and see what areas I can reduce my power consumption, and that can help me to achieve the requirements of the standards. Okay, so let's start off with part 2 first on interrupts. Okay, um, then later on I'll just give a short 5 minutes break. Okay, in between this. All right, so in our studio, we talked about, we introduced you the idea of interrupts. You have seen that before, all right, in some aspects. But in this studio, we saw the approach both using the sketch programming as well as in the bare metal programming. Okay, so the sketch programming, again, it is a single line solution, and everything is just sort of hidden from us, correct, what is really happening. But when you look at the bare metal programming, then you understand what is happening, and you sort of make sure you are appreciating the sequence of activities you need to carry out to make it work. Okay, and why it's important? Because after this module, you may use some other microcontroller, which will also have interrupts. All right, and it may not be an Arduino, so you can't rely on Sketch. So you need to know exactly the concept. Okay, so now you understand that, okay, if I have an interrupt in all controllers, there will be some global bit. All right, there will be a global bit to configure this enable and disable. All right, besides the global bit, then I know that within each peripheral I have some interrupt capability, and to configure interrupt capability, I must also do a enabling over there. Alright, so you understand that this is the next step. Then when you enable, you must be able to capture the event. So you must have some registers to say what kind of event you want to capture. Rising edge, falling edge, timer, compare, and so on. And when the event happens, you know that you must jump to a interrupt service routine. Okay, so with the understanding that these are the general steps involved, you can take this same knowledge and apply it to any other controller in the future. All right, so you know that, okay, these are the things I need to look out for when I want to do or when I want to use interrupts on some other new device, okay, for my project. Okay, so what are the hardware interrupts? Okay, so the hardware interrupts are basically something that is basically what we did in our studio with the switch. Okay, in terms of the higher level or more complex controllers or systems, you can think of it as something like this, where uh, you can have multiple hardware devices, all right, where you have the ability to send requests into the microcontroller. So this is the main microcontroller here, 8088 here, and what we are seeing here is that many of these interrupt requests, okay, for example, the timer, the keyboard, the COM port, and the disk, and so on, all of them are going through another sort of interrupt controller, which will then send the signal to the main microcontroller. All right, so this is one way in which many controllers manage interrupts. All right, so even in your laptop or your PC, okay, you have a lot of devices, subsystems that can generate interrupts. So your processor must be able to handle these requests, okay, as and when they come in. All right, so as what we saw, you are already having some main code that is running. All right, and when the interrupt is triggered, you must be able to send this interrupt request to the processor. All right, and in most cases, it is some interrupt request line that is sort of toggle or activated. Okay, and when that happens, you need to suspend your current activity and you need to jump to the interrupt service routine. Okay, when the interrupt service routine is complete, then the CPU can resume and then can carry on from where it left off. Okay, so that is the whole idea which you have seen in the studio. So in the main code I'm running, okay, so you do not know when the interrupt is going to happen, but when the event comes in, okay, whether it's a level trigger, edge trigger, whatever, you will jump, okay, to your interrupt ISR. Okay, of course, prior to jumping, there is some activity here, which is to save your current context. Okay, when you say save your current context, because you are running some code, so you are in the middle of doing something. So you need to save that snapshot in your local memory first, all right, and then you jump to the ISR, and then when you finish your ISR, then you are able to come back and carry on. All right, so that is the idea. All right, in our laptop, for example, your keyboard, your mouse, your network card, and so on, all of them generate interrupts whenever some event is being generated. How about software interrupts? Software interrupts are there when you are wanting to get some attention through some specific instructions that are in the system already. Okay, so for example, in Intel machines, they have this thing called INT, interrupt number. All right. So this interrupt number is actually a number that can specify what you want to do. Okay. So take for example, you want to uh, print a specific color on the screen. Okay. So you in the coding wise, you may say that I want to. You need to put some values in some registers, and then when you call this interrupt function, you will take the value, translate it into a specific color, and put it on a position in the screen. Okay, so the interrupts are triggered in the software itself to make the processor do something for us. All right, so that is where the sort of software interrupts come in. Okay, so just like before, the hardware interrupts and software interrupts, in both cases you have ISR, okay, for each of all of the possible software interrupts that are available in the system. Okay, the address of each ISR is flexible. Okay, and the CPU can be configured to jump to the correct ISR. Okay? Software interrupts again provide a way of some flexibility for software APIs to use some of the resources that a CPU is providing. Okay, so the processor itself may provide some resources, but they are generated through these software interrupts or requested through these software interrupts. Okay, so this is what I mentioned just now. If you want to write something to a screen, okay, usually you will be required to write some values into some specific registers that sort of specify, okay, this is the X and Y coordinate of this particular pixel I want to write to, and what is the color or value or something I want to write, and then after you put in the necessary values into the register, you trigger this interrupt and the activity is carried out by the processor. Okay, so that is a general idea of interrupts. Now, in the studio, we talked about, or we saw firsthand, the interrupts on the 8328. All right. So what are the interrupt request lines that are available? So there are two types of interrupt request lines. Okay. One is the interrupt 0 and interrupt 1, which we saw in our studio. So that was this. Okay, port D pin 2 and port D pin 3. Then there are 23 pin change interrupt request lines. Okay, so you can see that almost all of the other uh, pins have this PCINT, okay, associated with it. This is what you call the pin change interrupt request line. So let's look at what we did in the studio first. Interrupt 0 and interrupt 1 are very flexible, and they can actually be triggered by a variety of trigger sort of signals. You can have a low signal or a change in the signal level. That means as long as you change from low to high or high to low, or you can have rising edge and falling edge. Okay. Most of the times when we connect to switches, we prefer to use the edge as a trigger point, all right, so that it's easy to know that this particular event has happened. All right, and these are the registers that we configured. This is the register we configured during the studio, the EICRA register. All right, depending on whether you're using INT0 or INT1. All right, so these 4 bits will be able to configure one of these 4 options here. This is what we did in the studio. Okay, and each of these pins INT0 and INT1 both have their own ISR. Okay, both have their own ISR. So when I connect the switch to INT0 pin and I connect the switch to INT1 pin, and they are triggered, they will jump to separate interrupt service routines. All right, so that is again another important point to note, because if I have two separate events and I want to be able to process them differently, then I need to be able to differentiate between which device is the one that triggered the interrupt. All right, so that is why you have interrupt 0 and interrupt 1. Okay, in terms of the pin change interrupts, all right, how they are configured is they only respond to changes in voltage levels. So that's why we call it a pin change. So as long as it changes from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0, then it will trigger. All right. So even though you have 23 PCINT lines, you are only having 3 interrupt sort of vectors reserved for it. So it's not 23 different interrupts that you have. Okay, you only have 3 different interrupts. And the way they are grouped is like this. Okay, where for example, PCINT pins 23 to 16 will trigger PCI 2. All right, so what does that mean? That means PCINT 23 to 16. Okay, so let me go back here. Okay, 23 to 16. So where is 23? Okay. Okay, so 23 to 16. So this. Okay, so let's say 23 and 22. Okay, so 23 to 16 are all grouped together under PCINT 2. Correct. That means if let's say port D7 and port D6 are both connected to switches, and as long as either switch is pressed, okay, that means as long as the voltage level is detected on either one pin, both of them will jump to the same interrupt service routine, which is the one tied to PCI 2. Okay, so that is how the rest of the pins are configured. They are grouped together, okay, and you only have 3 unique interrupt service routines for these 23 lines. Okay, so now let's look at the context switching. So just now I talked about the saving and restoring. Now every interrupt request is assigned a number. All right, so that number is basically the number that associated with the interrupt vector table. All right, and what the CPU will do is it will test whether the interrupt request line of that particular peripheral has been activated. All right, so whether that interrupt 0 is activated or interrupt 1 is activated and so on. Once the interrupt line is detected to have been triggered, okay, it will take note of the index number and then it will look at the interrupt vector table using the index number. All right, and what is inside the vector table? The information inside the vector table is the address of where I need to jump to. Okay, where I need to jump to. Okay, so let me show you that again over here. So coming back here. Okay, so this is the interrupt vector table. Okay, so when I press the button, okay, that is already configured for INT0, you can see that INT0 has a program address of 0002. Okay, now when the microcontroller detects this interrupt, it will automatically jump to this address location 0002. Okay, it will automatically come to this address. Okay, because it knows that this particular interrupt line was triggered. But what is inside this address 0002? So you scroll down here, you will see the address 0002. There's actually an instruction here that says jump. Okay, that says jump to INT0. Okay, what is this jump INT0? This is actually jumping to the interrupt service routine. Okay, it's jumping to the interrupt service routine. Okay, so you must understand that. Okay, when the interrupt occurs, okay, when the interrupt occurs, okay, you are automatically going to address location 0002. But inside this address location, you say jump to int 0. So where is int zeros interrupt? Okay, this int zeros interrupt is basically wherever your compiler has stored your ISR. Okay, so if you remember, you have your ISR that is written inside your code. Okay, and that is for your int 0, correct? Int 0, and this address location, the address location of where this is in memory, will be actually stored inside here as part of this instruction. Okay, so inside this address location, there will be this information on where this ISR is stored. All right, because this location here can change. This address will change because this depends on how big your code is, what you're writing. All right, so if your code size changes, some lines change, and so on, the starting address or where the ISR is may change. But that does not matter because you already know that this ISR is meant for int 0. So this address where it knows that this is the starting point of the interrupt service routine for int 0 is already stored in address 0002. Okay, so that is why when the interrupt occurs, I know exactly where to go to. Okay, so it goes to the interrupt vector table using that particular line that was triggered, and from there it knows where it knows that I need to jump to this address location, which is actually the starting point of the interrupt service routine for this particular uh, interrupt trigger. Okay, now before it can actually make the jump, okay, before I actually make the jump, it needs to save the contents, okay, of the program counter onto the stack. Okay, so stack is basically part of the memory that is used for temporary storage, okay, while processing is going on. All right, so pushing and popping from the stack is one of the common operations that goes on a lot, okay, whenever you are jumping to subroutines and returning and so on. Okay, the program counter is basically the hardware, okay, built-in hardware of the processor that points, okay, to the next instruction to execute. Okay, now since you are already running your main program, all right, you know that while prior to the interrupt you're running a main program, so your program counter was actually already planning to point to the next instruction. All right, but before it could execute that instruction, the interrupt triggered. All right, the interrupt triggered. Okay, so that is why I need to make sure I save this onto the stack. All right, and then I'm able to update my PC to point to the ISR. Okay, so the PC is uploaded with a new ISR because it knows that the address is stored inside the vector table. All right, so I save the PC onto the stack, jump to the ISR, and then I can carry on. All right, of course, uh, when you say save the program counter, you may also save some other aspects of the processing that was going on. All right, but these are other registers or other information that is important depending on what it was executing at that point of time. Okay, so the program counter is just one of the registers. Then it loads the ISR, there's ISR, and then starts to execute. And finally, you return. Okay, so in assembly language, there can be a lot of different instructions. So one of the instructions for returning is called RETI. Okay, and when you execute this instruction, you will be able to return back to where you left off. Okay, and then you can carry on. All right, so this basically gives you the overview of what we just talked about. And one of the important things that you will usually see or usually come across is the discussion on this thing called the interrupt latency. That means how much time does it take, okay, from the moment the interrupt request is registered till the time I start execution. Okay, because this is the point here where I start execution. start executing Fusion of ISR. So how much time does it take? All right. So of course, one of the important things to note is that of course the smaller or lower the latency, the more responsive the system is going to be. All right. And of course, this may not necessarily be consistent all the time because it depends on what you were doing at the time. What instruction were you doing or you were executing while this interrupt request came in? Right? Because you need to finish that particular activity first. Okay, that instruction you're executing, then you need to save your context. So when you say save the context, program counter is one of it. Then plus some other registers that may be holding some values that were currently being used at that time for that computation. Then only you can jump. All right, of course, after you finish, then you can restore and then you start to go back to where you left off. Okay, the next important thing is, of course, nested interrupts. For nested interrupts basically means what happens if you are in the middle of an interrupt and another interrupt comes in. Okay, so one of the things is interrupts have priority levels. Okay, we haven't really covered this much yet, but you will be seeing this in the next video. Okay, if a new interrupt has lower priority than the current interrupt, it is ignored. Okay, until the current interrupt completes. If the new interrupt is higher, that is more important, then you will actually do the switch or contact switch one more time. All right, so let me show you over here. So this is easier. So if I'm in the middle of something, and the ISR comes in. So this can be considered a low, medium, and high priority. Okay, so first the low priority task comes in, but before it can finish, low priority interrupt comes in. Before it can finish, a high priority, another medium priority interrupt comes in over here. And again, before I can finish, another high priority interrupt comes in. Okay, so the higher priority interrupts keep preempting the lower priority interrupts. And when the higher priority interrupts finishes, then I sort of roll backwards until I can go back to my main code. All right, so this is the idea of nested interrupts, okay, based on the principle of priority. Okay, the peripheral or the interrupt that is more or is having a higher priority will be able to preempt the one with the lower priority. So important questions, okay, for us to know is what are the priority levels of the various interrupts? Okay, so for this, you can look at datasheet page 26. All right, if you look at datasheet page 26, okay, what do you see? So let's look at it here. So datasheet page 26. Okay, 26. No, I think it's the wrong one. I think it was just now there. Okay, page 82. Okay, let me change it here. Okay, wait, let me just look at 26. Maybe the information was there. Okay, so yeah, it's correct 26. Okay, so it is actually written here. The interrupts have priority in accordance with their interrupt vector position. The lower the interrupt vector address, the higher the priority. All right, so if we come back to your vector table, basically this order is the one that implies the priority. That means reset is the highest, followed by int0, followed by int1, and so on. Okay, so the order of this vector table itself is telling us the priority. Okay, so that is the first thing here. So this is correct 26. Okay, now the next thing. So we talked about nested interrupts just now. So our nested interrupts enabled by default. Okay, so datasheet page 32. Can you all just have a look at it and tell me whether it is enabled or disabled? And then open up the datasheet and quickly go through that page to see where the information is and put it in the chat whether you think it's enabled or disabled. Okay, so again, I'm emphasizing this so that you are comfortable and familiar with extracting important information from the datasheet. Okay, so if you haven't downloaded the datasheet, please do it. Okay, go to the page. Okay, the datasheet was part of the material I gave for the GPIO Studio. Okay, in your Luminous, it should be there. Okay, so as the answer here, no. Yes. Okay, so that is the correct answer is no. So let me just show you in the datasheet itself. Yeah, so this is the one. Okay, when an interrupt occurs, the global interrupt enable bit is cleared and all interrupts are disabled. Okay, the user software can write a logic 1 to the I bit to enable nested interrupts. Okay, so all enabled interrupts can then interrupt the current interrupt routine. All right, so as you can see from the datasheet, okay, by default, the nested interrupts are disabled, but you have the ability to override that behavior in code. All right, so these are two important things we must know, and we will actually be looking at again later on for the PWM part. Okay, let's just take a short 5 minute break. Okay, now it's about 5:02. Okay, just take a short 5 minutes break to have a breather, and I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. We're just going to do a quick recap of some of the other concepts, and then we will finish off with the PWM part. Okay, so let's just have a short 5 minutes break. Okay. Okay, so let's carry on. Okay, so before we carry on with the tutorial, let's just take a quick diversion back to our schematic. All right. As I mentioned, every week I'll try to share something interesting and something useful for you all so that it will help you as computer engineers. All right. So if you look at this, uh, put it this way, your microcontroller or the Arduino Uno runs on how many volts? Okay, Arduino Uno, okay, you have runs on how many volts? What is the supply voltage? Okay, yeah, it's 5 volts, correct? Because when you normally connect, you connect it to the USB cable, through the USB cable to your laptop, all right, and that USB port is 5 volts. Okay, now, of course, if you look in your Arduino Uno, you can power through the 5 volts, which is coming from your laptop. At the same time, there is also a sort of a barrel connector there, correct, for the power socket. All right. So that power socket, okay, if you look in your schematic, okay, it's in the top right hand corner here, where the power socket comes inside this connector here called X1. Okay, and it passes through this component here, and then you get a 5 volts. Okay, this component is the NCP 1117. Okay, can you all do a quick Google and tell me what is this device? What is this NCP 1117? What is it doing? Okay, correct. It's a voltage regulator. Okay, so what kind of voltage regulator or what does a voltage regulator do? Okay, a voltage regulator basically is a very simple device that takes in a voltage within a range. So the voltage that is coming in can usually have a range, maybe 5 volts up to 15 volts or something like that. Okay, but it will guarantee a fixed output depending on the type of regulator you're using. So this NCP 1117 gives us a fixed plus 5 volts. Okay, and this kind of regulators are very commonly used in many devices because it allows you to take any voltage and provide fixed voltages at different points in a circuit. Okay, so I can have the same input coming in to another regulator and provide maybe plus 3.3 volt output. and so on. Okay, so I can take a single voltage supply coming in and use different regulators to give me a fixed voltage for different parts of my circuit. All right, so that is where a voltage regulator comes in handy and useful. Okay, so that is something that you can learn, okay, from this schematic. All right, so along the way, if you explore a schematic part by part, you will get to have some ideas. Okay, how can I build my own circuit? What are the things I need to do, and so on. Okay, so it will slowly get you thinking about the hardware aspect of this kind of design as well. Okay, so let's come back to our slides. Okay, so in our studio, Interrupt Studio, we were talking about the volatile variable. Okay, so this volatile variable, what exactly is it? Okay, so let's recap this. Okay, in case any of you are still not too sure. When you are writing, of course, you're writing in C, but when you compile, it gets translated to assembly language code and, of course, machine code later on. Okay, now when I look at this code over here on the left hand side, okay, if assuming I didn't put the volatile variable, I didn't put the volatile keyword, I just keep it as integer x equals 0 and I write this statement. Okay, what would the compiler think? Okay, when it looks at this code over here. Okay, so when it looks at this sequence here, I have created a variable, put in a value 0. Okay, and then over here, what I've done is in this part of the code here, I'm comparing x with a value 0. So when you're comparing x with a value 0, you're taking whatever value that is currently inside x. Okay, that means I need to read from x. Okay, since x is a variable, this x is stored in memory. Okay, and whenever you want to access variables, what your compiler will do is it will have to first transfer that data from the physical memory to an internal register. Okay, so different processors have different sort of design in terms of how many registers they have and all this. Okay, so there will definitely be some internal registers for you to use. So what will happen here is prior to this while loop, okay, I will have an instruction that will do a load from memory where I will take the data from X and put it inside maybe R7. Okay, so think of it like a pseudocode over here where I'm taking the physical the data from the physical. Then this line here, while x equals 0, will actually be done using R7. Yeah, because you use the internal registers to do the comparison. And you will see that, okay, in this entire section here, this entire while loop, there is no instruction, that writes to x. Okay, there is no instruction that writes to variable x. So since there is no instruction that writes to x, it is actually doing us a favor by thinking smart. Correct? So it is trying to optimize it for us and say that since nobody is writing to variable x inside the code, then I do not need to waste time to read from x again. I can just use my R7 indefinitely while I'm inside this while loop. Okay, so the compiler is doing the right thing. It is trying to optimize the performance by seeing that since there is no write to the variable, I can just use the value that I read last, okay, and use that throughout this entire while loop. Okay, but what it does not realize is actually there is an interrupt that is writing to x. So when I write to x, what is happening? So when this instruction is executed, okay, what will happen is I will load, okay, technically I will load one to a register, maybe R5, and then store R5 into X. Okay, so I will take a value of 1, put into a register, and take that register value and put it into X. So when I say put it into X, I'm writing it into the actual memory. Correct, writing in the actual memory. But this is not reflected in the main code because in the main code, the compiler did not see any write to X. during this entire while loop. So it is still using R7. All right, but the actual X has already been updated in the memory. All right, so this is where the volatile keyword comes in. If I use the volatile keyword, I am forcing the compiler to say that every time I'm going to read from variable X, I cannot depend on the last read register value. I need to do a fresh read again. Okay, so instead of relying on R7, this instruction of load R7 into X and then do a check while R7 equal to 0 will be part of the loop. So this check here will happen and the loop will come back here. Okay, so this whole thing will be the loop. So every time I do the while loop, I need to take from X, put into my register first, and then I can do the check whether R7 is equal to 0. So that helps me to capture any change in the actual X variable in memory. All right, so that is why the volatile variable is very important when you have shared data between interrupts and the main code. Okay. Okay, so that was just to wrap up on the interrupts. So let me just go on to the last part here on PWM. So the PWM, you basically use the DRV 8833 H-bridge motor driver. Okay, so this H-bridge motor driver, you have used something similar in EPP1, okay, where you're driving the motors, but that was a single IC chip, all right, and then we actually connected up. We're actually doing the same thing over here, all right, and what your motor driver chip does is it allows us to boost up the output voltage, okay, to drive the current, the enough current get into the motors. Okay, like what I mentioned just now in the studio as well. When you have the PWM coming out is 0 volt and 5 volt. Okay, but after the motor driver, it will be boosted up depending on what is the voltage. So if I put 10 volts here, then it will be 0 volt and 10 volts. Okay, around there. Okay, so you are able to provide a larger output voltage to drive the motors. Okay, and in the studio, the last part, basically what we were doing is we were changing the direction, okay, based on configuring either one side to be connected and the other side to be disconnected. Okay, so whenever you put 00, you are disconnecting. All right, so you will behave like a normal GPIO pin, whereas the side that is connected will be generating the appropriate PWM. Okay, so that allows us to have the dual direction. All right, so either I'm going this way, that means this way, or the other way, A out, A2 to A1. Okay, so it's either A1 to A2 or A2 to A1. Okay, so that is basically the direction or how we achieve the directional change in the code. Okay, so another thing that some of you may still be not sure is how do I know that the output compare of timer 0, A and B, where do I tap from? Okay, how do I know which pin I should look at? So that is where you need to look back at the pin mapping of your data sheet. Okay, so a pin mapping in the data sheet of the microcontroller. So if you look at the pin mapping, you will see the OCOA and OCOB, okay, which are the timer 0A and B channels. Both of them are mapped to port D pin 5 and port D pin 6. And port D pin 5 and port D pin 6 are also mapped to Arduino pin 5 and 6. Okay, so you need to be able to link these things together. That means first, your peripheral output, which timer are you using? All right, and then from that timer, okay, where is it mapped to in terms of the port pins? And those port pins, how are they mapped to in terms of the Arduino pin? All right, and then you know exactly where to tap from. Okay, so that is why we're using pin 5 and pin 6. Okay, so this mapping cannot be changed, correct? You cannot say I want to use pin 3 and pin 4. No, because pin 3 and pin 4 are not. Okay, I mean, you can't say I want to use port D pin 3 and pin 4 for the timer 0 output, because internally it is already wired that it only comes out, or it can only be channeled out to port D, pin 5 and pin 6. Okay, so that is how we decide which pin to use. Okay, so let's look back at the PWM module, okay, and some other aspects of it. All right. So we know that there are 3 timers, okay, timer 0, timer 1 and timer 2, and each of it has 2 channels. Okay, so timer 0, 1 and 2. Okay, so maybe I can go back to the data sheet here. Okay, so over here you can see timer 0, 1 and 2. Okay, so even though we only studied timer, looked at timer 2, timer 0 yesterday, we will be looking at other timers next week, studio. All right, and all of them are quite similar, except that if you notice, timer 0 and timer 2 are 8-bit, timer 1 is 16-bit. Okay, so the main difference is the range of numbers you can count. All right, if I say 8-bit means it's only from 0 to 255. 16-bit is the range of the 16-bit timing counting. All right, so that is the main difference, but other than that, most of the functionalities would remain quite consistent between the 3 different timers. Okay, and if you look at it, all of them also have the same sort of block diagram. So all of them have the same channel A and channel B. Timer 0, timer 1 and timer 2, all of them have channel A and channel B. Okay, so we have a total of 3 timers. That means I can actually generate 6 PWM signals concurrently at the same time. All right, so that is the advantage of having hardware driven peripheral modules like this. Okay, because as you saw in the activity 1, once I do the setup, it is automatic. I do not need to do anything in my interrupt. I do not need to do anything in my loop, nothing. All I need to do is to set up the PWM module, and once that is done, the PWM signal just comes out. All right, and it will just keep on coming out without having the need to execute any other code. So the hardware driven solutions like this are very convenient, okay, to help us multitask, because you are able to generate PWM and it can run the motors while I'm busy doing other things. I can read the sensor values, I can check the switches and so on. Okay, so let's look at questions here. So the first part is describe a software approach to generate a PWM signal that is not dependent. All right, so with the hardware PWM block, of course, it is very good, makes life very easy for us. All right, but if let's say you don't have this and you want to go with a software approach, how would you do it? So basically it is nothing more than just generating on and off signals, correct? Okay, but of course you only need to be careful about how much time you want for T on and how much time you want for T off. All right, so basically you can think of this as a sort of pseudocode, okay, to say that you just configure the pin as output, set as 1, delay, set as 0, delay, and repeat. Okay, so it is fairly easy to create your own PWM signal. Of course, it is quite obvious that the main issue is uh, you can't do anything else useful or more productive, because you're basically stuck there continuously trying to keep up. Okay, and you have to also remember if there are interrupts, all right, because if let's say while I'm doing a delay for T on, okay, during this time here, what if there is an interrupt trigger? I say it's a push button INT 0. So by the time you do the context switch, you go to ISR, you finish and you come back, then you still have to finish up the delay for T on. Correct. So all of this will sort of impact the timing characteristics of how your PWM will behave. Okay. So with the block or the hardware block, you only need to do the setup code, and everything else is sort of automatic. Okay, it's done in the hardware for us. Okay, so if let's say I do not have any PWM module, all right, and I still want to generate PWM signal, but I do not want to use the software approach that I saw just now, how can we still go about doing it? So you can think back at your EPP1, what are the hardware-based solutions that you have done? One is to use your 555 timer. So if you recall your Week5 Studio 2, okay, Week5 Studio 2 from your EVP1, you did this experiment, okay, where you hooked up a 555 timer and you saw this, of course, the RC charging and discharging is one of the things you saw, but this high and low is the outcome that you want, correct? The output, the PWM signal output. All right, so this is one way of generating a PWM signal without even a microcontroller. And so no software involved, no controller involved, pure hardware solution, and it can still work. Okay. Now the next thing is you feel that the approach in the earlier part is going to add additional costs, and you decide to switch back to the 803280P, and you want a very low frequency PWM signal. Even with the largest prescaler setting, the period is still too high. Okay, so what does that mean? When your prescaler is right, is to basically divide down your clock frequency, correct? So from 16 megahertz, you can divide by 2, by 4, by 8, and so on. So if you want the period uh, to be uh, sort of uh, longer, okay, you want, even with the prescaler setting, it is still not able to achieve the actual frequency that you want, okay, a very low frequency that you want. Now what can you do? All right, because if you're 16 megahertz and you divide, you get the lowest frequency depending on the prescaler setting. But even after that, it is still not the one that you require. All right, then what can you do? Okay, so there are two possible approaches. Correct. One is you can use ISR. Okay, so this picture is not uh, representative of the 8328 in particular, but I'm giving you the idea that okay, let's say I have a crystal here that is running. So I have an oscillator is 4 megahertz, then it sort of internally clocks down to 1 megahertz, and I have a prescaler. But after the prescaler, it is still not yet slow enough. The frequency is still not low enough for me. What I can do is I can let the timer register run until it overflows. All right. So what I can do is I can say that the PWM, all right. So we know that instead of generating a PWM directly in the module, I can use this to trigger a timer. So a timer module is basically something that will count, let's say from 00 all the way to FF. Okay, and after that we can roll over. And when it rolls over, I can say, okay, generate an interrupt. So whenever it generates an interrupt, then I can have another register to keep track of how many times it has rolled over. Okay, so if it rolls over one time, I have completed 256 counts. All right, then I multiply by C, which is the number of times it has rolled over, plus the current duration. So this is the starting, this is the ending. So maybe I stop halfway. So this is my current value, B. So B minus A plus the number of times I've rolled over. Okay, multiplied by 256. Okay, so that gives me an idea of, or gives me a way of making the or generating a PWM that is even lower frequency. All right, so I can say that when this register value hits a certain number, then only I toggle. Then only I toggle. So I wait until C equals some particular value. So that gives me the required delay that is not possible within the 0 to 255 range over here. Okay, so that is one possible option. Okay, the timer part, don't worry too much. We will actually be doing timer on Tuesday. All right, so you can actually see how timers work and how you can link back to this question after we do the studio. Okay, the other option is I can straight away use a higher bit timer. Okay, because if I have a higher bit timer, I can come from 0000 all the way to FFFF. Okay, so automatically I have a much larger range, so my frequency can be much lower. Okay, so that is the other option of using of generating a much lower frequency signal. Okay, so this is the last question. Okay, this one is on the interrupts. Okay, so if I'm using both motors concurrently, all right. So if you look back at the driver chip, okay, our motor driver chip, you have A in 1 and A in 2 and B in 1 and B in 2. Okay, that means technically I need, okay, 4 PWMs if I want to drive both motors in dual directions. Correct? I need to be able to have these 4 different PWMs. So for 4 different PWMs, I need 2 timers. All right, I need a timer. I need a timer here. I need a timer here. Okay, so let's say I use timer 0 and timer 2. Okay, and since I'm using both the timers and I configure both of them to use interrupts, okay, uh, what would happen if both of these interrupts would be triggered at the same time? Okay, what would be the sequence of execution? Okay, so if I'm running my main code, okay, and let's just say that both of them come exactly the same time, timer 2 interrupt and timer 0 interrupt. So who would go first? Okay, so to answer this, you need to come back to our table, correct? Because just now we just saw that the priority is actually based on the order of this vector table. So you can see that the timer 2 is having a higher priority than timer 1, and timer 1 is having a higher priority than timer 0. Okay, so coming back here, you will see that timer timer 2 has higher priority. So I'll execute the timer 2 interrupt first, and then I'll context switch back to the main, and then I'll switch back to timer 0, and then I will context switch back to the main. Okay, so this is basically the sequence that will happen, all right, if I were to have this scenario where both the interrupts are triggered at the same time. Okay, uh, what if the scenario changes? I timer 0 triggers first, okay, just before timer 2, then timer 0 will run first and then followed by timer 2. Okay, why? Because by default, okay, okay, we say that there is no nested interrupt. Okay, so since by default there is no nested interrupt, if timer 0 is being serviced, okay, timer 2 will have to wait. After you finish timer 0 finishes, then only timer 2 will be able to run. All right, so that is the default behavior. Okay, so how do we know that timer 2 needs to be serviced? Because whenever the interrupt is triggered, there is a flag that will be set. Okay, so this flag that is captured by the system will tell the controller that there is still this interrupt service routine that needs to be executed. Okay, because the interrupt has been triggered, but I have not executed the ISR. Okay, so that is why after I finish the first ISR, I'll be able to do a context switch. Okay, and later on move to the second ISR. All right. Now, if I were to enable nested interrupts, then the situation will change. All right, because if I enable nested interrupts, then timer 0 ISR will get preempted by timer 2. Okay, and then after timer 2 interrupt finishes, then I can resume my timer 0 interrupt. All right, so this is of course if you in your software, when timer 0 interrupt runs, you go and re-enable the interrupt global interrupt enable pin bit. All right, then this nested interrupt sequence will happen. All right, so this is just to give you the idea of how it will normally execute and how it will execute nested interrupts. Okay, timers we will do again. Okay, we'll see again on in Tuesday's studio. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Okay, so I know it's a tiring and long tutorial, especially on a Friday. All right, but since we sort of group them together, we had no choice. All right. So for next week, it is only on Tuesday. All right. So there is no second studio. There's no tutorial. All right. So just make sure that you come prepared. Is it graded Tuesday? Let me just check. Okay, it's not graded. Okay, so next week is not graded, the studio one. So that is good news. So you can relax a bit, but it's also good to be prepared, all right, so that you know that you can finish up the lab on time. If you don't come prepared, all right, then you will find that you will spend a lot of time trying to then go through the material and then understand what is going on, and then only you can start the activities. All right, if you just do some uh, preparation by looking through the material beforehand, okay, looking through the studio handout beforehand, your studio session will run a lot more smoother. Okay, and you will feel better also after that. Correct, that you are able to complete all the activities that we have for you. Okay, so that's all I have. Have a good weekend. I will still be on the line for any questions that you have. All right, if not, thank you very much. Okay, and I will see you all next Tuesday.